How the faithful city has become a whore. She who was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your best wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause does not come to them. Welcome back to the Dominion Podcast, Season 2. I am one of your hosts, Jeremy. Don't call me Greg Boyd. No relation to the
heretic,
to the known heretic.
And I'm Alex.
All right. Well, we're glad to be back here. I want to give some shout outs to our sponsors before we start. Upper40.com. Check it out. He just dropped a new single this week, so go check that out. Of course, our unofficial sponsor, KCCS, Kawartha Classical Christian School, which we're both on the board of. So happy to be here, and we've got a very special guest today. I'm going to let Alex do a little intro, and then we'll get into our topic.
Yeah, so as our listeners know, the theme of our podcast, you can tell from the name, is Dominion. And essentially what that is, when we think about dominion, we're thinking about what it means to rule in biblical categories. We're thinking of what it means to live under the rule of Christ and what it means to rule over creation in his name. And our kind of overarching theme and belief is that humanity was created in the image and likeness of God to take dominion. And so we want to think about the rule of Christ in every sphere of our life. And we've covered a lot of topics over the last few years. But one thing we haven't delved too deeply into is the stewardship of resources. So we could think of money in particular, but even resources more generally. And kind of the current cultural understanding of the world and its resources and how we accumulate them, whether we should accumulate them, how do we steward that. I mean, even the idea of stewardship is a biblical idea. And so we thought that we would bring on a friend and a help to the podcast. This week we want to have a conversation with Jonathan Wellum. Jonathan is the president and CEO of Rocklink Investment Partners, Inc. He's had a long and prestigious career in investing. He's previously served as a CEO of Portland Investment Council. He is the recipient of various industry awards, including Fund Manager of the Year from Investment Executive Magazine. He's held positions in corporate accounting and is currently a member of the McMaster University Investment Pool Committee. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce and a Master of Business Admin degree from McMaster University and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Waterloo. He's completed his formal education with a Master of Arts degree in Theology and Philosophy from Trinity Seminary in Chicago, and also holds the designation of Chartered Financial Analyst. Basically, we wanted him to come on because he has a wealth of experience and knowledge in the area of finances. Jonathan is also a family friend. He is an elder at Trinity Baptist Church in Burlington, which has actually become quite close as a congregation to both Hill City and Westmount, where Jeremy is a deacon over these last few years in particular. So thank you for coming on, Jonathan, and being willing to talk to us.
It's a privilege to speak with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is actually not just because of your experience in finances, but more particularly your experience as a Christian man, a theologically minded man, and the way that you apply your faith to the area of your expertise. And this is something in my own experience, it is just very uncommon. So when I read things about finances or about resource management, I'm typically reading from someone who is not a Christian.
Yeah.
And maybe in the past, there has been a whole lot more shared assumptions between Christians and, you know, the leaders of these financial institutions and just the way we think about resources in general. But especially in the last 3 years, we've seen the disparity between worldviews, especially in the area of finances and resources. And as Jeremy opened with, was that from Isaiah?
Yeah, Isaiah chapter 1.
Isaiah 1. And I was just thinking about, over lockdowns, many people don't realize that during lockdowns, there was the greatest wealth transfer from middle class to upper class in the history of the world. That more people were thrust into abject poverty than ever. And the kind of ideologies that underline the fiscal decisions are not small. There's a massive difference between the way that Christians ought to think about the world and the way that unbelievers do. So we want to talk to Jonathan about how his faith and how a biblical worldview has come to bear in his life. So maybe I'll open it there for you, Jonathan, is, in what ways has a Christian worldview, or does a Christian worldview impact our understanding of finances and resource management? Like, a lot of people think that's just mathematics and worldview thinking is philosophy, and they don't relate. But
math is neutral, of course. There's no worldview implications.
Yeah.
Well, as we know, there's no neutrality in this world. And that's certainly become more evident as we're seeing the divergence in our Western civilization. We're seeing it diverge further and further from our Christian roots, where there were so many assumptions built into all of the areas of life. So, I mean, I was raised in a home, a Reformed home, and it definitely had a worldview orientation. And so I always thought that finance, politics, economics, science, medicine should all relate back to your Christian worldview and presuppositions early on in my life. And so, when I got into finance, I just built off of those foundation points. So let's just take a few moments to consider, some of the sort of foundation or presuppositions of a Christian worldview and why and how they're going to impact economics, which really is human behavior. You're talking really about human behavior. So if you think of the most foundational starting point, is we start with the sovereign creator God. So we start with a created world. Right away, that tells us that we are subject to that creator's order and structure and rule. And we believe, of course, in the infinite personal God, a God who is a personal God who has moral characteristics, and his character is what fills the universe and what establishes the moral absolutes that we are to live by. So that's foundational, because if you're going to talk about human behavior and activity, and you don't start from a point of creation and a personal God, you're going to go off track very, very quickly, very quickly. This is the Lord's earth. The second part of that, which runs from that first point, is that God has created this world for us, and he's created for his glory, but for us, he's put us as human beings made in his image in this world, and it's a very resourceful world. So then you get into the whole issue of, okay, there's resources in this world, and God's placed us here, as you say, to have dominion, using the name of your podcast. And that means, as stewards and having dominion, we're to actually develop those resources, not lay them fallow and let them sit there, but we're supposed to be productive. We're to be like God in the sense of busy and active and thinking and active creatures. And so we talk about some of the issues in our own day where we're not to touch the earth's resources anymore. We aren't to have dominion anymore. In fact, we are to be subservient to the creation. Well, that changes your whole view of economics dramatically, as we're seeing. And so, the Bible also, basic presupposition starting point is that work and economics are honoring to God, and that's why he's placed us here. So, work, as we know, precedes the fall, and it's also something that we have to do even more so after the fall, because our lives are frustrated by the curse of sin.
That's right.
And so all of these things come together when you think of Genesis 1 and 2. Everything that God has laid out from his, starting with himself as the creator, and then this ordered universe that's structured for his glory, but for our good. He's placed us here to utilize all these resources, to be in fellowship as male and female, two genders, starting with the family unit and so forth, long before the state. This is going to have a massive, massive impact on your economics. And I would argue that if you're looking at the problems that we're seeing today, they are a dismantling of Genesis 1 and 2 and a rejection of the fall, basically. And so everything we can look at that's going wrong will get you back to those, basic starting points being unraveled or attacked, by our world, by our culture, and of course by Satan ultimately.
So much of what we've seen in the last 100 years has been this attack on Genesis, right? Obviously, from a scientific perspective, there's been an attack on it. And Satan's doing that for a reason. He understands that is really the foundation of everything we believe. But that's a good point you make. What we're seeing now is humans are a blight. We're kind of a...
Yes.
A cancer.
We're a cancer, and the earth is good, people are bad, so we need to minimize our effect on the earth for any good or bad. I mean, there would, in their minds, probably be no good effect that we would have on earth. So we need to minimize that. Can you talk a little bit more about what that leads to? How is it that pagan worldview affects economics? The fact that we shouldn't be affecting the world.
Yes. And even before I go there, it's quite interesting. If you looked at this world, if you go down to, people love to go to Florida, they love to go to some of the Caribbean countries and so forth. If you think of places like Florida, and you think of if man had not had dominion over that area and clean things up, the mangroves and all of the low-lying land and the barrier islands that were just full of mosquitoes and so forth, largely uninhabitable. I use those as a very stark example of how you can create billions and billions and billions of dollars of value in an economy by shepherding and stewarding the land that God has given us, just in an area like that where people like to go down and enjoy themselves. You weren't doing that 100 years ago in Florida unless you had man intervene in the created order, not to mention, of course, all of the extractive industries that we benefit from base metals to the oil and gas. But how does that impact? Well, if your view is that man is the cancer, that we're the problem, and in fact, it's gotten so crazy in our universities that the solution is to stop reproduction altogether, that children are the largest contributors to carbon, and therefore, since children are the largest contributors to carbon, we should stop having children. We should stop having families. And when you think about that, that is the direct attack upon Christ. It's a direct attack upon God, that we are not to have families. I mean, he ultimately is building his church, and we need to be reproducing, and he's doing that through procreation and so forth. And that's a direct command that we were given to have children. And yet our world, by twisting the environmental game and the whole climate change agenda, at the end of the day, what it really gets down to is to kill off man, to get rid of us. And that's the ultimate objective. And we've seen that slowly come in through abortion, and then through now euthanasia and infanticide. I mean, it's just continued to develop throughout our culture. But how does that work itself out? If you just think, well, in our current environment, if we're going to just look at the world through through not intervening with it and not creating any disturbance to the world, and you have that sort of attitude, well, think of the last couple of years where they're trying to go through an energy transition, this big energy transition they're talking about. So let's get off all fossil fuels. Let's get off, clean coal, energy sources that have created, that have given us tremendous advances, a lot of energy, which we need to run the economy, take many people out of poverty around the world. So let's just push this agenda that we have to decarbonize and get rid of all fossil fuels very quickly. Well, what happens? You have to substitute that. And if you're going to do a substitution quickly without, the technology developing, you're going to go to solar, or you're going to go to wind and some of these alternatives, you're going to create tremendous inflation. You're going to, inflate the cost of energy, and artificially, because we have low energy cost sources. And so if you're going to increase inflation, that's what we're seeing around us, you're going to drop people's standard of living automatically. And that's because they're pushing this agenda a lot faster than it has to be moved, if at all, of course, but that's a different story. And so if you get caught up with a climate change, a green agenda, that the environment is going to be better off without fossil fuels, and you push that agenda and that dominates, expect lower standards of living, expect higher prices across everything, expect higher interest rates. We're going to have higher levels of inflation. And so that will then have to run through the whole economy. So once you start triggering and making decisions like that and not thinking through the implications or not caring about the implications, you're going to have serious impacts throughout the whole economy. And that's one of the biggest reasons why we have inflation now, aside from the printing of money and our silver becoming dross, as Isaiah says. Is this whole energy transition. We're forcing up the cost of energy, and every single thing we do requires energy. And if that cost goes up, it has to go through the whole economy. So that's just one example of a forced agenda on us, and the cost of that. Yeah.
So one of the themes that comes up over and over when you think about the nature of unbelief is the denial of consequences. So we see this in the beginning in the garden. God says, "Do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day you do, you shall surely die." And then Eve is tempted, and it's with the lie. It's like, has God really said this? And you will not surely die. And beneath that is a rejection of the consequences of our actions. Yeah. And we see this. A Christian worldview of economics, in the very least, is built on the idea that our actions have consequences, and we need to think about those consequences. There's nothing you can do that won't have a consequence. But when we think about lockdowns and closing businesses, and when we think about the green agenda, I mean, the irony is in pushing this green agenda, quote unquote, we're actually making the environment worse by forcing countries to go back to coal. I mean, Germany fired up its coal plants again.
Yeah. And they claim that climate change affects the poor more than the rich, but it's their actions that are actually affecting them, because in countries now, they're not allowed to use these cheap sources of energy anymore to pull themselves out of poverty. So it actually, our policies are making
inhumane.
Life worse for the poor. When our standard of living drops, we've got enough capital here that maybe it's not going to hurt us as much. But people that are right on the edge of poverty, it's those people that it's really going to hurt. Yeah, there's those consequences.
Yeah, and they don't care. They don't care. If you get behind the agenda, you start peeling it back to the individuals who are pushing this agenda. They know that it is a lie. And this is really for much larger control purposes. It's transitioning economy much more for control. And these two are inextricably linked. In fact, for many of the leading so-called elites, if you will, they really would prefer to see a world population back under 1 billion people. Yeah. And so if there's casualties along the way, they do not care at all. And we can see how perverse, evil, wicked, and just downright satanic. Many of these large decisions are, behind the scenes, the decisions that are being made on a large scale. And so that's where we have to push back, of course, and to work through, from a Christian point of view, as Alex pointed out, we're living God's world. Yeah. And if you make bad decisions, then you're going to be impacted and you can't get away from it. If you make decisions that are honoring to God and consistent with his moral instructions and biblical revelation and created order, then things will go well for you, generally speaking, even in a fallen world, that God will reward those decisions. You go against him, you are fighting a losing battle, and it's going to be a painful one.
So I want to talk to you about one thing you raised, Jonathan, and that is the fact that a Christian view of the created world is not that it is limited in its potential, but that it actually has a great potential that is meant to be cultivated, the biblical language, to work and to keep. And God put man in a garden, but he actually had the purpose of man extending that garden throughout all of creation, the order and the beauty that was there. And there's this fallacy that says our resources are limited, that we are a cancer, that we ought not to touch things. But even when we think environmentally about, conservation. So if you actually, like I went and visited the forest a couple of years ago that I grew up playing in. I grew up in the country, and I spent we weren't allowed to watch TV. I spent every day, all day outside. And I went to go through the forest, and you couldn't because it was too dangerous, because all the trees had fallen over. They had died. This huge, rich, beautiful forest of my childhood was completely overgrown. If you leave nature on its own, it doesn't just remain in this serene environment, that it actually decays. And it's the same with animals. If you don't actually hunt, like one of the things hunters will tell you is that this is a means of conservation. You don't like the idea of a deer taking a bullet. That is the most merciful thing that could happen to that animal, because if we don't, the way that animal will die is by starvation because of overpopulation, or it'll be ripped to shreds and eaten alive, by a wolf or something like that. Like, it is actually just wrong that the world is the humans are a poison. But one of the ways we've seen this fleshed out, when you think of a Marxist view of economics, is that Marxists believe that we accumulate wealth through redistribution. So
there's a limited pool.
There's a limited pool,
and it's a zero-sum game kind of idea.
Yeah, and it belongs to these people, and the way we get it is we demand or we take. But a Christian view is that the mechanism for accumulating wealth is labor. And it's no wonder, I don't know what it's like where you live, but our current generation, who was raised in Marxist ideology, who was taught to resent the responsibilities of labor, who was taught to resent those who have, also feels totally unmotivated to work. Like, there's a crisis in the workforce, and I think it's because people don't understand why. Like, people don't know why you are supposed to work, because it's not tied to resources. So I don't know, Jonathan, do you see that? I mean, that's all I've grown up with in school, is that money is something the government have or rich people have, and we need to get it to us. But a Christian view is that we develop the resources God's given through the sweat of our labor.
Right. Yeah, well, I think with the loss of the Christian worldview, we shift from a production orientation to a consumption orientation, and that's really significant. So, God has put us on this world to produce, to make things, to provide services, to make things, to be productive. And if you focus on production and stewardship and developing those resources, you'll have lots to consume. If your preoccupation is on consumption and redistribution, which is a Marxist or socialist way of thinking, you'll have less and less to consume because you're producing less and less. And so this gets back to the area, if you really want to unlock and unleash the human potential that God has given us, you need to allow people freedom. And they have to have freedom in their vocations, in their work. They can't be encumbered again by the government, and they should have freedom to use their gifts and abilities to the maximum. And under God's providence, that will create tremendous production. If they have access to the resources, and they're not. The regulations are not such that they're strangling, which is what we also see now, this control of over all of our resources by the government. And so if you unleash the gifts that God has given us, and you allow people in a free market to do interchange and commerce back and forth, you will produce tremendous wealth. And the proof of that is the Northern European countries versus the Southern European countries, which are dominated by Catholicism versus the Reformation, or if you look at North America versus South America, and you see, or Australia, New Zealand, where the Anglosphere, which was impacted also by the Reformation and Christian thinking, that's where all the wealth was produced, and that's where you have the highest standards of living, and so it works itself out in very profound ways, and you start to circumvent that, and people think that somehow wealth just appears. You get into this. Right. This again, we've been taught this a little bit more recently with our central banks, that you can create wealth by printing money. Well, you can't create any wealth by printing money. You're giving people money or calls that they can use to buy productive assets, but you have to produce the productive assets. You have to produce the products. You have to make this, be there to, give the services. And if you just give people more money and it's sort of free, you're actually stealing from those people who've done the work.
Yeah, you're only subdividing. You're only
Yeah.
subdividing the existing wealth. You're not creating new wealth.
Yeah, and of course, is what we've seen now. If they continue carrying that on to the extent we've seen through COVID, now we've got inflation, and so you're not getting anything more. You're just paying more for it, and our standard of living starts to drop.
Could you touch on that a bit more, Jonathan, just for our listeners? Like, what is inflation, and why is it bad? And even if it's not, people don't feel as though it's affecting them too severely at the moment. I think most people would recognize it. But why is how is inflation caused, and why is it bad?
Yeah. Well, the major cause of inflation would be you'd have excess money in the system, that you have more money chasing fewer and fewer goods. And so you sort of bid the price of the goods up. So if you think about it, in the last 3 years, the federal government in Canada added about $300 billion of fresh money that is printed and distributed out into the Canadian population, basically. And so all of a sudden you've got that money going after the number of goods that are out there. But if you haven't increased your production and you haven't increased the number of goods, then you're just going to have a certain amount of money chasing the same amount of goods, but you're increasing the dollars. You're just going to bid the price up. And so you start taking the price up. Inflation also can come from just lack of productivity. And if we're not becoming more productive, over the last, I think, 10, 20 years, our economy has become less and less productive. Now, technology's helped in some areas, but as you've pointed out, people are, their work ethic's is not as robust, and people's, interest in working, creativity. I think creativity has dropped in our society. We've got excess regulations and so forth. But inflation really is a tax, because if you have to continue to pay more for things, then you're really being taxed, and your standard of living starts to drop. So ideally, if we were in a really strong, productive economy, and we weren't in a debt-based economy, which is what we are in, ultimately, if economy is becoming more productive and you're not increasing the money supply, the price of goods should continue to go down. We should be able to buy more for every dollar. Now, where you've seen that, just to give, so people can identify with what that means, is if you look at the technology industry. The technology industry, we've seen prices drop for quite a few years on computers and laptops and things like that. If you go back 20 years and you looked at the kind of power that we have now, it would cost you a lot more. And so in the area of technology, the efficiencies have grown so much faster than even the inflationary pressures. But at the end of the day, the reason why you don't want inflation is because it steals from you. It's really a form of theft, and it means that you're not running a productive economy, and you're going to have your standard of living is going to go down unless you can push your own wages up to compensate for it. So it's really a form of theft, and again, it just results as a result of too much money chasing too few goods. If you think about the situation we're in right now, and we've had this inflation in the last year and a half or two, it's really jumped up. It's not, we're not used to seeing this. And that's been because there's been supply chain disruptions because of COVID and lockdowns, which was crazy. So it interfered with supply chains. So we couldn't get goods. So people would bid up the price of what they could get. We've had money flushed into the system, and people haven't been working. So that money that was added has bid the price up. And we've also got just this energy transition. So our energy costs are going up because the governments are putting way too many regulations and impediments to developing our energy resources and keeping energy costs down. So it's multifaceted, but in each one of those cases, this is gross economic incompetence.
Right.
And these are all due to human decisions driven by ideology. Our standard of living is being attacked by a Marxist socialist ideology, and so expect inflation to continue if we're not going to focus on production, lowering regulations, keeping energy costs down, controlling our money supply more appropriately, balancing budgets. We don't do that, then we're going to get inflated away. Our wages are not going to, stay up and keep pace with this, and people's standard of living is going to continue to erode.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that a Christian view of economics is really based on a number of very clear and understandable principles, and that because the temptation is to feel like the economists know things that we don't know. They're part of the expert class. It takes, I mean, obviously you do want a measure of expertise when you're doing things, but would you say the biggest problems with our economy are actually owing to big mistakes regarding simple principles? It's not actually like they got this complex formula wrong in one spot and you could forgive them. It's that we're doing very basic things wrong. Is that fair to say?
I say you're dead on. I think that's a great way of putting it. We sort of the high priests of economics, and in every area has its own high priests, right? Mm-hmm. Are the experts. But what we find in many cases is those experts are really not as experts as we think. Right. And good dose of common sense and biblical principles would put us much further ahead. That's certainly the case in economics. I think the basic economic principles are very straightforward. The Bible lays them out very clearly. Mm-hmm. If we were to follow those, we would be much further ahead. What we get is interference by the state, interference by the government, and regulations, control, and what you really need in a dynamic economy is you also need people to lose money. And there's nothing wrong with venture capital, and there's nothing wrong with it having success and failure. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges over the last 20, 30 years is that we have created a zombie-like economy. When I say a zombie economy, that we've bailed people out too much. Mm-hmm. And it's a good thing when people try something in business and they, maybe they blow their brains out. It doesn't work out. Mm-hmm. But that means the capital, they tried, the capital will fall into the hands of the more prudent people. Mm-hmm. What we've seen is that the central banks and the government, every time there's major problems in industries, they step in and they bail out the individuals who have made the mistakes. Right. And so they perpetuate bad business models. They perpetuate an economy that's not as competitive. And we've seen that especially in the banking sector. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good thing. This cheap money, we've lived through basically 15, 16 years of very cheap money. When I say cheap money, 1-2% money. And so we haven't had accountability for our capital. There hasn't been a proper cost on our money. Mm-hmm. And so if money's cheap and it's easy to get, then it's going to flow into people's hands that are not responsible and are not prudent, are not focused on making good returns. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen that with the recent Silicon Valley Bank situation. I mean, down in Silicon Valley, money was just flowing freely. Mm-hmm. The central banks were pumping it into the system, and there's loans going out to people who should never have received loans. Mm-hmm. But when money's cheap, your standards are lowered. Your business models and the discipline you're using as you allocate capital to businesses go way down. And so all of a sudden money just starts going into people's hands that it shouldn't go. Mm-hmm. And then we create this moral hazard in our economy. And so a dynamic economy also will have business failures and then clean things up. Mm-hmm. You can't just keep things going. So I think one of the challenges we're facing right now as a result of all this mismanagement and PhDs in finance and economics and banking getting your hands into all of this, who've never run a business, have never signed the front of a check, have no responsibility in allocating capital of their own. Mm-hmm. It's always someone else's. Mm-hmm. Is that we've got to clean up a lot of these zombie businesses, and we will have some defaults, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a nice thing. Mm-hmm. It can be painful, but in a Christian economy, there's consequences. Yeah. Your businesses are successful and they fail, and then you try it again. And there's nothing wrong with failing in a business adventure. We should be, in a Christian economy, it should be very dynamic. We should have tremendous entrepreneurs and reward risk taking that's been thought out and deliberative. And I think God honors that. And the Bible exhorts us to trust in God and to be creative, to cast our bread upon the water. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we trust the Lord and we work at it. And so we've lost a lot of that. We want a lot of handouts, everything guaranteed,
Yes,
and on a silver platter, and not work for it. Yeah.
So can I, the question you just asked about the simple principles that should lie behind a Christian view of the economy, I think it would be good for you to maybe spell out some of those. Where are they coming from in Scripture, so that when we're analyzing policies that the government is coming up with, or we're analyzing certain things, we can measure it against whatever these simple principles are. Can you lay some of those out for us?
Sure. Well, I mean, you can start with the principle of work. I mean, the Bible makes it clear: you don't work, you don't eat.
Yeah.
And Paul speaks to that issue, and of course, he also makes it clear that if you are an orphan or if you're a widow, you're the vulnerable. You protect those, you help them, and you put them into a position where they can work. But certainly, social welfare is not supported by the biblical text in any way, shape, or form. And I find it quite interesting how sometimes people call themselves Christians are socialists, and you're thinking, the Bible has no room for that. The Bible also encourages, because we're made in the image of God, the whole issue of work and responsibility, and we should be able to work in the areas that we have been gifted. And so the whole issue of vocation is a biblical teaching throughout all of the Scripture. And to utilize those gifts, and we see that right from the Old Testament through to the New Testament. I think the Bible also tells us that we should not centralize control, and because of sin. And so, whenever you have individuals who promote large, powers, whether it's in government or in certain businesses that are going to control more and more of the economy, the Bible would warn us against concentration of wealth and concentration of power. And so that's one of the biggest reasons for a free market, that God has created us free within His moral absolutes, but we are to engage in commerce and trade, and we are made to not just communicate as individuals in a fellowship, but also in commerce and business, to trade amongst one another, that there's huge advantages in trade, and the Bible certainly emphasizes that and speaks to that issue. And so right throughout all of it, of course, accountability, planning for the future, building for the future. I think one of the things that Christians should always be thinking about is, how am I building for the next day, month, year, and 100 years? We should be very long-term in our focus, and we should be building for the next generation, the generation after that. We should be long-term in our view. And that's a Christian view, because we know that God ultimately is behind everything, and this is His story, and we believe that His purposes are coming to fruition. There's meaning and purpose, and there's telos in everything that we do. And so a lot of times Christians, they look at the world, especially the world we're in today, and they go, man, there's chaos. What's going to happen? We're going to, the Lord's going to return tomorrow, type of thing. I can see all the panic. We're going to, we have, digital currencies. We've got the WEF, and you go through the whole list of things, right? But we shouldn't be viewing that way. We should be, again, good representatives of Christ, standing for truth, pushing back against evil, but also building institutions that are going to last. Because the institutions that we're seeing now in our culture, the universities, our medical institutions, and so forth, I mean, they're in free fall. They're collapsing. They're not bulwarks anymore. And so we have to constantly be looking forward and building. The other thing that the government, if you look at the Bible, I should say, speaks about is low levels of taxation. The Bible in no way supports, large levels of taxation. You can see the taxation system in the Old Testament was generally in the 20-odd% range if you were to add it all up and so forth. But the Lord warned the people about kings and taking too much money and controlling too much of the economic pie. And so again, when you look at our situation today, I've used these stats before, but in Canada, back in 1960, only 15% of our total economy would have been government expenditures. 15% if you took our total gross domestic product, all the production. But in 2020, that number was 52.5%.
Wow.
So we've had this massive expansion
crazy.
of the state. That's over half of our GDP. In countries like France, it's over 60%.
Wow.
And so this, again, is a complete inversion of a Christian worldview and a Christian view of government and its involvement in all aspects of our life. And we would be, should obviously be pushing back against that. And we're seeing that as the government grows, it's a ratchet effect. It really only grows one way. It's very hard to take it back.
Yeah.
And the taxes go up and up and up. And we're at a point now in the United States, also in Canada, the Western world, where our governments are so large, we cannot fund them with tax dollars anymore. They're so large. The deficits in the United States, at the federal level here in Canada, if they were to actually plug those deficits, they would not have the tax dollars to do it. The only way they're doing it now is by printing money and filling the system. And the only way you're ultimately going to balance budgets is a massive cutting back in the size of government. We must cut back the size of government. We must privatize substantial portions which the government currently controls. And unless we are prepared to privatize and put that back into the hands of the people, our standard of living is going to, again, continue to go down because the government is too large. And as you guys know, if there's one inefficient, ineffective, and generally incompetent sector, it's the government sector. It's not subject to competition. They're the worst allocators of capital in the economy. So don't give them a large portion of the economy. If we do that at our risk and at a lower standard of living. Yeah.
Well, there's no consequences.
Right.
Like that's why, like in a free market, as you say,
Yes.
there's fundamental to a free market is consequence.
Yeah,
And
there's
so
pressure
there's-
by other people trying to make the same product as you,
Yeah.
so you've got to compete.
In the free markets, if you think about the free, it was quite interesting. If you look at the dirtiest economies, I mean, in terms of pollution and not caring about their people, they're all socialist communist countries.
Yeah.
They're all these utopian countries. The cleanest, most efficient economies are going to be ones that have the highest degree of freedom in them, because there is accountability, as Alex has pointed out. There's consequences. If you want to have the best ability to keep people honest, put them in a free market. Because if you're running a store or you're creating a product and it's not high quality and you've got a competitor that is, they'll get all your business.
Yeah.
And so the same thing with you're running a restaurant and you're not coming up with the best of meals, and you've got someone competing down the street at a lower price and they're gathering the business, you're out of business.
Yeah.
And so the free market actually, again, nothing's perfect in a fallen world. It actually enhances the attributes that we should exhibit as Christians: honesty, integrity, quality. All of those things are actually lifted up in a free market. They are deprecated and they're pushed down wherever you have control and you don't have a free market. And that's why free markets thrive when you have Christian virtues and Christian ethics within them. But they also bring it out too, because if you don't have, again, some of those ethical demands and you're in a competitive business, you're out of business.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful checks and balances that you have in a free market. And a lot of, again, Christians, they don't see that. They say, well, the government doesn't have to make a profit, therefore it's going to be more efficient.
Yeah.
And you go, no. Profit is an indication of financial responsibility. It's honoring to God.
Yeah.
It's absolutely honoring to God.
Yeah.
Because we've been efficient with resources and we have some extra that we can then use in Christian administration gifts or pouring back into the business to grow it further. And so savings and profits are very much biblically honored, God honored. Again, if they're done ethically, of course, in selling a product and service that is consistent with God's character. And so a lot of these things, Christians are really mixed up with, and they don't understand in any way, shape, or form. And, if we think a $6,000 a night hotel room in London is a good idea, that's our prime minister. That's our money. That's our money. He doesn't care. And so again, so free markets are by far the most biblically consistent and also God-honoring ways to conduct economics, and also keeps us in checks as sinners.
It also generates the most economic success. I mean, there's no question about it that the free market works better. So where are all the rest of the Christian economic intellectuals? I mean, there's you and David Bahnsen and, the late Gary North and then other than that, what do we got? Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, who weren't believers. But that's where are all of you? I mean, you're here. That's awesome.
Yeah, I don't know. There's another excellent gentleman who is a friend that is a very good thinker and a Christian, Peter Hall. I don't know if you've heard of Peter Hall. He just actually stepped down, retired from the EDC. He was the chief economist at the Export Development Corporation, and he's a good man too. You should actually someone that would go on your show. I know Peter, and I mean, he had to work within the strictures of government, but did that in a very honorable way as a Christian, and certainly has tremendous insights. He would be early 60s, lots of energy, and doing some wonderful work in on consulting and other activities currently. So there's a handful, but you're right. There's not an awful lot. It seems to people seem to be held captive to the economic philosophies of the day. And they're very dangerous. They're very, very dangerous because it really deals with capital allocation and whenever you're talking about money and control and central banks and capital allocation, it gets into some of the big issues and implications are very large for all of us.
So one of the things that's coming out in all that you're saying is what theologians call the antithesis. So the antithesis between sin and righteousness, belief and unbelief, that the world is not neutral towards God, that you either love God and are loved by him or you hate him. And what Satan is doing is inverting all that God meant to be good and turning it and actually calling it evil, as we read the prophet, right? Woe to you, call evil good and good evil. It's a direct inversion. So what have we been told for 30 years? Well, free markets are greedy capitalists. That's all it is. Profits is only owing to greed. And if you want to care for people, especially the poor, you will be a socialist. And what we're seeing is that played out without exception has been the total inverse. That where you allow for people to take up responsibility to work and to gain profits, you actually see, one, there's never been a middle class before this. Like the middle class is a totally novel thing in world history. It's a result largely of reformational thinking. And so it's a total lie. I don't know if you want to touch on that, Jonathan, but I hear you talk and I'm like, everything that they tell us is the exact opposite of what is true.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think as you guys know, I mean, the Marxists tried to use sort of the old Marxist lie on the Western countries and separate people on economics, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And that didn't work because we had a middle class and people that worked in factories had high standards of living up until the last 20, 30 years. And they could afford a home and live very comfortably and had tremendous freedom. And so what they've resorted to, as we all know, is then, okay, let's use other areas and other ways to divide people and to get them to attack each other. And that's introduction of, critical race theory and the whole issue of intersectionality. And then on the economic area, this whole ESG area where they've, corrupted, all three of those areas. I mean, when they talk about environmental, they're not talking about anything to do with the environment that we're talking about. They're talking about attacking the economic system and undermining the economy. When they're talking about social issues, they're talking about sexuality and all sorts of perversions. And when they talk about governance, they're talking about gender identity and nothing to do with merit and responsibility, but the color of your skin. So we have seen a complete inversion, and it's quite disturbing to see that. And I think as Christians, we must go back to our worldview, our fundamental understanding. We have to understand the implications of that and not be so naive as to what's coming out. And I think that's the biggest issue. Christians are not equipped theologically. They really don't understand the presuppositions and how they work themselves out into the various areas of life. And we saw that even more recently, if you think of the whole area of healthcare and the medical area in the last 3 years, we saw, again, Christians really fall down in that whole area in responsibility too.
So one of the things you touched on, and I heard you speak on this before, and it actually really impacted Rebecca and I, and we shared it with our board the teachers on Monday, is you reference Ecclesiastes 11, and you say, I'm just going to read this because I think this is an important point that Jonathan has raised, especially in this time. And it says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8. For you do not know what disaster may happen on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. I have a specific question. In the last several years, we have seen the virtue of risk avoidance, or risk avoidance is cast as a virtue. So the reason the phrase stay home, stay safe carries any moral weight is because people feel avoiding risk is inherently righteous, is inherently virtuous. And so that's why everyone went along with lockdowns. What I'm wondering is how this relates to the area of economics, personal and institutional, regarding savings versus producing or investing, maybe I'll say. And it was interesting. I tried to find Bible verses to justify savings recently, and it was actually hard to do. There's a principle of living within your means. There's a principle of thinking about tomorrow.
An inheritance, that's right.
Yes, an inheritance. But that's not actually the same thing as hoarding. And those are two different things. And we look at the parable of the talents. And so one of the temptations for Christians in this time, you already mentioned, Jonathan, is to simply try to survive through the not spending what we have. And while there's a certain virtue in that what the Bible seems to tell us is that faithful Christian living in this world, regardless of how, if we see the wind or if we're worried about what's going to happen, it means sowing your seeds still. It means you still have to go and plant crops if you want to have a harvest. And so how do you think about this as a Christian, some involved in finances? Like, should Christians be like building bunkers and just buying gold and Bitcoin and that's it? Or should we be building businesses and looking for investments that will accumulate and grow? And do you see a difference in those two activities?
No, I think those are excellent points, Alex. No, and I think that when we're talking to clients and we're talking to strong Christians and what they should do, is we're trying to get them to diversify and to have their eggs in a few different baskets, including some real estate and they might own some silver and gold. That's fine, but not to bunker down. To own some in businesses and to stay active. And so I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that Christians should not be preoccupied with retirement and sitting back and just sort of living off their capital. They should be constantly thinking about how they're going to continue to deploy that capital and take some risk, because we know the God who holds the future. If anyone's going to take a risk, if you will, to use that word, it's those that believe in the sovereignty of God and that he's working out all his purposes for our good. And so we're not going to disengage from the economy and step back. I think we should be as busy as possible, and we should be entrepreneurs and starting businesses and making sure our capital has got some safety levers on it. So in emergencies, we've got some protection. And obviously, as people get older and they maybe have physical limitations and they cannot be as involved, they're going to be able to do less.
Yeah.
But to the extent that they can make sure that some of their capital continues to be a blessing and is being multiplied, and even more so in kingdom work.
Yeah.
So how can they invest it back into kingdom work, back into Christian education, into, I think in the future, more into Christian medicine, Christian healthcare, as our healthcare system completely breaks down and is controlled by really a culture of death. So, no, I think we should be much more risk takers. We should encourage entrepreneurship amongst our young people, to build businesses, to invest back in those businesses, to hire other Christians, to be much more independent, and to continue to have an impact on the world and the economy. I mean, one of the things I enjoy in my own business is that, I'm part of the financial service industry, and I have my own company. I can run it, but I have a voice, I have a say, I have an involvement in it. If we're not running a business, if we're not, just sitting in retirement and not working and so forth, we have less and less impact on the world that we're in, and we should be having a large impact. So one of the ways to be salt and light is to be allocating capital and working and creating products and services that you can sell to other people and be involved in economic relationships.
Yes.
We just had our custodian was by yesterday. The custodian, that's the bank where our clients hold their assets, which is one of the large chartered banks. It's one of the smaller ones. But it was interesting. He said, we're all Christians here at Rocklink. And he said, you guys are one of the nicest companies to deal with. He said, you just love all your people. And I said, I hope that's the case, because we are all Christians, and, hopefully we're forgiving, and when things don't work out well, we're kind and we're patient and things like that. But we still are tough on you. You need to get, do what you have to do. And so I think, Christians should look at much more involvement in the world. I was fortunate in 1990 when I got in the financial service industry. I worked for 19 years, a very, very entrepreneurial person, Michael Lee Chin, who has become, much more well-known in Canada he was an immigrant from Jamaica. The benefit of working with Mike, even though he wouldn't, share the same intensity of Christian faith that I have, he was certainly appreciative of that and was supportive. But I saw a person that was willing to take risk, and always looking for opportunities.
Yes,
and that encouraged me in my own life. It was a positive stimulus, and I think as men, we need to encourage again the next generation. It's nothing wrong with take a risk, try something. If it doesn't work out, that's not a failure.
Yeah,
that's you're growing in your knowledge of the world. And so I think that's something that as Christians we should. I think the passage in Ecclesiastes and the wisdom literature in the scripture speaks to that in such powerful ways that I love that passage in Ecclesiastes. If you focus on the potential rain, you're never going to go out. If you think it's always going to be windy, you'll never do it.
No.
And yet every day we have to go out and do what we can do. And then at the end of the day, we'll see what God has blessed us with, and God is gracious, and He's amazing what He does through people who are just willing to do a little bit every day and to make that steady progress in the kingdom.
Well, Jeremy recently started his own business, and you would say that was a positive thing for you, finally pulling the trigger on that.
Oh, for sure. It means I'm not going to get fired for saying something wrong on Twitter, first of all. But now I'm having to start to think through this. So, I'm in my mid-40s. I've never put money aside for retirement up until a couple of years ago when the company I was then working for had RSP donations, that sort of thing. But now that I'm on my own, I'm thinking, how am I going to do this? And so I'm going to be emailing you later. Just heads up on that. I got some questions for you. But
well, one of the benefits is, so as you invest in your own business, you're creating value. And one of the things you should think about is, how do I then sell that at some point? You can monetize the value of that business, or hand it to another generation, and then in case they buy you out. So when you are building a business, you're creating a nest egg also in that business.
Yeah. So what I wanted to, if you were talking to a young man, this has been so helpful, by the way. Thanks so much, Jonathan. I've been trying to encourage several young men in my church to consider starting businesses for the reasons we're discussing. And now I recognize that if there is such a thing as an employer, there will be employees. So there will be guys who work for people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But inasmuch we are telling men who are gifted and capable to don't let your fears be the thing holding you back. You started a business later in your career. What would be, 2, 3, 4 things if a young man came to you at Trinity and said, hey, I'm looking to start my own business? What would be some general counsel that you would give him in today's age?
Yeah, count the cost. You do have to sit down, I think, and you develop a budget. The Lord in the Bible tells us, in the parables, Jesus speaks to this. The people of this world are more shrewd sometimes than the people in the kingdom. And so I think you should a budget. Okay, and of course, what product and service you're going to offer, and think through your differentiation and why someone would want to buy that product or utilize that service that you're making. So I do think you have to sit down and have a business plan and lay things out. Now, you don't have to. Business plans can get too extensive, but at least you want to have a pretty good sense of where the money's going to come for the first little while and who's going to be supporting it. So just to lay out a basic business plan and look at your competitors and then create some mentors, find individuals that you can bounce ideas off of, and individuals who have been successful that are willing to answer questions for you and give you some helpful points along the way. So those are just some very fundamental, obvious, and essential things to do. Because sometimes people will say, "I'm just going to start a business," and they haven't really counted the cost. And because you do have to have a certain amount of money up front to start, and you have to be able to go for a period without having much income, and then. So you should plan some of that out, just so that you're not starting something and then getting discouraged in the next 3 to 4 months type of thing, and then just blowing out. It does take a while to build a business. It's like a hockey stick, right? It goes slow, and all of a sudden it can really take off. And you want to be able to get to that point where you get the benefits of all of that work and laying of the foundation, which is necessary in a business. So plan, have a couple of people you can talk to. Have some good mentors, and then away you go.
The last question I have is another practical one. As Christians, we value we recognize the personal responsibility to work. And as Paul says, a man who doesn't provide for his family is worse than an unbeliever and denied the faith. He's not rebuking people for being poor, right? He's rebuking men who refuse to take on the burden of love for their family, to be so indifferent to even their closest loved ones that they won't care for them. And such a man is in no meaningful sense a Christian. You can't have the love of God and not love even those who are most close to you and you're most responsible for. So we want to recognize that we won't have, and others who need our provision won't have unless we work. And we want to reject a socialist view of economics that's purely redistribution. But Christians in the past have built lasting institutions by partnering together. And so one of the things we've been thinking through, we started a private school because we believe that Christian education is one of the most important things we need to be giving ourselves to right now and into the future. And we are like those people who built the cathedral, knowing that they would never worship in it. Their children would never worship in it. Maybe their grandchildren down the road. It takes a lot of people coming together to actually, unless you have several very wealthy people, which honestly in the long term isn't even as sustainable. Like, yeah, if Bill Gates gets converted and sets up an endowment for Kawartha Classical Christian School, then sure. But by all accounts, that's not going to happen. But my dad's family's from Holland, and he tells a story about, I think it was Leiden University, and it was built from, there's these cups that the poor Dutch people used to have in their homes, and they used to put their pennies or whatever in it. And it was their collection together that they gave and contributed towards this. So sometimes, in my mind, like if we want hospitals right? I mean, we can't rely on healthcare. I spent time in healthcare, and it's scary. I mean, we're at a day and age where you don't know if mom and dad go in, if they're just going to euthanize them. If we need hospitals, if we need schools, if we need these institutions, how do you think Christians work together in such a way that promotes personal responsibility, yet utilizes the gifts of the body, including their resources? Have you thought about that?
Well, I mean, I've given it some thought, and I think the need is there. And so there's no question that I think that Christians need to provide more and more products and services amongst themselves. Right. And even in a bartering economy, depending on what kind of interference we get with our money and digital currencies and all the things that could come out of that. How that would work, I mean, I think after all said and done, we're just going to have to create really effective networks and prove the value of that so that people contribute to it.
Yeah, right.
And I think it will be self-evident at the time, if you will. But I do believe that, I mean, in our own business, as I say, we're all Christians here, and we service a lot of Christians also. Yeah. And so it provides a place of employment for people who share Christian values, research analysts, research professionals, and salespeople. In fact, even last year, we hired a new individual, came from the mutual fund industry in Toronto, and because of the secularization, it was just a harder and harder environment to work in, and some of the whole vaccination rules and things like that. And so we created a safer environment where that person can excel and develop their God-given gifts. So I think it will become more self-evident, but I think that building communication channels amongst Christians, amongst churches that share similar values, we really need to network much more effectively. And then out of that, I think will come naturally, organically, the needs. You can think of another big area will be I think hospice care. Because with our state, the state will not want to invest. We'll try to invest as little time as possible in anyone who is even remotely terminally ill. And it'll be a very difficult environment for people in that position. And that's a perfect environment for Christians to demonstrate the love of God in Christ at a point of death and so forth. And so just like we've done when pregnancy centers and things like that, where we're trying to protect. So I think that there will be more and more areas. And if the government increasingly becomes, basically broke and does less and less, we might actually be able to do more things because the government really can't do it anyway. I mean, and just like the Christian schools, I mean, the government's, our public school systems are absolutely disintegrating right in front of our faces, and we absolutely need an alternative. In schools like the Kawartha one, and what's happening with Aaron Rock, and we see with Jacob Reum, the Trinity Bible, and they're creating thriving schools, which are absolutely essential for the next generation. And so I think it's starting to happen, but we need to really work together and have share common goals, share common objectives, biblical truth, and not step back and let the society push us off to the side.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's
thank you so much.
The last thing I say, I mean, as we know, the way the world is operating in a complete rejection of God, it's going to fall apart.
Right.
It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to work. And so as Christians, we want to be showing an alternative, the better way, the right way. And we just keep pushing. Even when they're pushing back against us, we know that we are on the right side, we're on the winning side, and we have the truth.
A city on a hill.
Yeah, and you're right that stupidity never is a long-term plan for success. As Doug Wilson's fond of saying, stupid doesn't work. So... Yeah, and it's a shame because it's going to mean the destruction of a lot of our civilization and the things that have been built up. But you're right; that is a great opportunity to rebuild things and show the love of Christ through how we do that. So, well, if that's it, you don't have any more questions.
I'm good.
I got like 100 more, but it's all about milk cartels and minimum wage and stuff like that. Maybe we'll do that another time. But for now, we'll leave everyone with this. May he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May all kings fall down before him, all nations serve him. We'll see you next time.